Egypt was divine, that's what made it so dangerous. It gave the world medicine, calendars, architecture, wisdom carved in stone and preserved in gold. But beneath the sun, gods and funeral hymns, something else was happening, something more intimate, more disturbing. While the temples reached toward the sky, the rituals dug into the flesh. Power wasn't just displayed through monuments, it was enforced through bodies. A god who created the universe by pleasuring himself. A pharaoh commanded to repeat that act in public, so the Nile would flood and the crops would grow. Corpses prepared for the afterlife with artificial genitals, foreign girls taken as war prizes, sisters married off to brothers to keep bloodlines pure, and, deep inside the tombs, priests touching mummies to reawaken their senses, mouths, eyes, and sex. And the most terrifying part? None of it was considered cruel. It was sacred. It was law. This isn't a parade of strange customs. It's a mirror showing how easily religion can be used to disguise control, how the body can be sanctified into silence, and how the line between worship and violation was drawn in limestone, then passed down through dynasties. If you think you know Egypt, look again. The truth is buried deeper. Before there was earth, there was nothing. No sky, no wind, no moon to break the silence of the night. Just black water, still, endless, silent. And then, as the Egyptian story goes, something moved in that darkness. A ripple, a will, a god who created himself. His name was Atum. He rose from the chaos, fully formed, the first and only. But even gods are not immune to loneliness. There was no one to speak to, no other shape to recognize. He was alone in a world where not even time had begun. So he reached for himself. Atum masturbated in the void, and from that solitary act, the world began. His semen gave birth to the gods of air and moisture, Shu and Tefnut. They, in turn, birthed the sky and the earth, and from them all things followed: light, crops, language, law, life itself born not from violence but from pleasure. This wasn't a myth whispered in private. It was etched into temple walls, recited in hymns and taught to children. Atum wasn't blasphemous, he was the model of creation. What he did wasn't obscene, it was cosmic. In a world where survival depended on the fertility of the land, the link between pleasure and power was not just understood, it was institutionalized. Over time, that myth became obligation. When the Nile hesitated to flood, when the crops began to dry in the fields, and the winds shifted just slightly wrong, the people turned to the pharaoh, not for policy or speeches, but for action. Sacred action. Because the pharaoh was not merely a king, he was the living god Horus, the son of Ra, the earthly extension of the divine, and in the ritual calendars of the state, he was expected to perform a miracle, one borrowed directly from Atum himself. Each year, at the edge of the river, under the eye of priests and temple scribes, the pharaoh would reenact the moment of creation. He would stand in ceremonial linen robes, his body oiled and prepared, and he would masturbate into the Nile. And this was not symbolic, it was real. The ceremony was called the Ritual of the Sacred Flood. His seed, like Atum's, was believed to carry the spark of renewal. If it reached the river and the gods accepted the offering, the Nile would rise, the soil would darken with silt, the fields would breathe again, if not, famine. It was agriculture by orgasm, cosmology as performance, an entire civilization balanced on a single moment of royal climax. There are inscriptions in the Karnak temple that describe this act without euphemism. One relief shows a pharaoh standing near the water, flanked by officials holding scrolls and offerings, his right hand extended downward. Another shows the ritual chamber, sealed off from the public, but never hidden. This wasn't a scandal, it was statecraft. Even foreign visitors, Greek historians like Diodorus Siculus, described it with fascination and discomfort. One wrote that the pharaoh's act was neither perverse nor secret, but divinely required. Another observed that Egypt was unlike any other place where the gods live among men. and men are made gods through duty. But imagine the pressure. You are not simply king. You are fertility itself. The rains fall if your body obeys. The river moves if your desire can be summoned on command. And all around you, priests reciting the ancient words, hands folded, eyes lowered, wait in silence, hoping the kingdom survives. We often romanticize pharaohs, picturing them lounging in palaces, issuing decrees with the flick of a finger. But in this moment, their rule was raw, fragile. One failure of the flesh could doom an entire harvest. One moment of weakness could be interpreted as divine disapproval. In a civilization where life depended on rhythm, the cycles of the river, the turning of the sun, the pulse of the womb, the pharaoh's body was a metronome. And this ceremony made his sexuality not just sacred, but nationalized. The deeper cruelty is this: once the ruler's body was turned into an instrument, every other body could be reshaped to fit the same mold. If the king's pleasure was divine, then controlling the body of a woman, a slave, or even a child could be rationalized. If sex could renew the land, then sex, under the right rituals, could also dominate it. This was the root, the first crack in the wall. It began as a myth of loneliness, a god alone in the dark. It became the foundation of empire. So when the Nile trembled and the priests gathered and the pharaoh stood at the edge of the water, it wasn't just a ritual. It was a command issued by myth, enforced by tradition, and watched by the gods. The people called it sacred, but sacred doesn't mean safe, because once the pharaoh's body became divine, every other body beneath him became fair game. If kings could summon life with a single touch, what else could they take? What else could they own? And as Egypt's armies pushed south and east into Nubia and Canaan, what began as creation turned to conquest. Women captured in war weren't just prisoners, they were offerings, they were trophies. And the next emperor would make sure everyone knew it. The armies marched south, past the fertile edge of the Nile, into Nubia, into Kush, into lands rich in gold, cattle, incense, and people. And when they returned, they didn't just bring tribute. They brought women. The inscriptions call them gifts to the gods. The records, etched in stone and copied by scribes, list them plainly: 40 cattle, 2 bolts of linen, 12 jars of incense, 18 foreign girls. There's no poetry in it, no ritual hymns or moral hesitation, just inventory, because by the time of Senusret III, the empire had grown bold, and the pharaoh's needs had grown with it. Egypt wasn't just protecting its borders, it was feeding an appetite. And the body, once sacred and symbolic, had become something else entirely, a commodity. Senusret III ruled during the 12th dynasty, nearly 4,000 years ago. He was known as a builder, a reformer, a warrior. But he was also the architect of a system that treated human lives, especially the lives of women, as assets of conquest. After his campaigns in Nubia, inscriptions on boundary stones don't just celebrate military victories, they gloat about humiliation. "The Nubians are vile," one text reads. "They are cowards. I have taken their women and their children and their pride." These women, often girls, were not protected under Egyptian law. They were war trophies. They were assigned to temples, households, and harems. Some were forced into ritual roles. Others were simply kept. They didn't speak the language, they didn't practice the religion, but their bodies were absorbed into the empire, just as their lands had been. We often think of harems as luxurious courtyards filled with perfumed lovers. But in Egypt, the reality was closer to a prison, structured, guarded, and strictly ranked. The royal harem wasn't a place of romance, it was a political factory. Inside, women were categorized. Egyptian noblewomen held status, but foreign captives were placed at the bottom. They were referred to as female dependents, and their job was simple: to be available. Temple documents from the Middle Kingdom list dozens of these foreign women by name, not as individuals, but as line items. Some of them were assigned to serve goddesses like Hathor, often in positions that included sexual service as part of ritual performance. Others were given directly to the pharaoh as concubines, a gesture of both domination and divine legitimacy. Because if the king controlled the bodies of foreign women, he controlled their nations. And if he fathered children through them, those children could be used as diplomatic tools. Sex wasn't separate from the state, it was strategy. It wasn't just Senusret. Thutmose III, a later emperor, led 17 military campaigns and returned each time with prisoners, many of them women. The records are precise, hundreds of captives, many labeled as beautiful of form, a phrase that had nothing to do with military threat and everything to do with sexual value. One wall painting even shows captives paraded before the pharaoh like livestock, heads bowed, arms bound. He is seated, unmoved, as priests assess their features, whisper their measurements, and assign them fates. These were not rare moments, they were routine. Conquest meant control, and in Egypt control meant reproduction. The strange cruelty of Egypt wasn't just in what it did, but in how calmly it recorded it. There was no effort to hide this system, no shame in the acquisition of beauty by force. Tomb paintings show women with curled hair and foreign clothing kneeling before Egyptian mistresses. Their hands are raised, not in prayer, but in obedience. And the scribes who captured these images did so with discipline, not judgment. This was the order of things. This was how empires preserved themselves. In temples, the pharaoh was painted offering incense to the gods, but in the palace he was offered women. Some historians have tried to soften these facts, arguing that captives were assimilated, that they were given homes and food, and that their children were educated in Egyptian ways. But what does it mean to be assimilated when your body was taken before your name was even recorded? What kind of consent exists under chains? Even in elite circles, royal women had no guarantee of safety. They were married to brothers, exchanged in alliances, kept behind walls. And for the foreign concubine, without title, language, or home, the walls were thicker still. And yet, this system didn't collapse. It worked. For generations, it expanded the pharaoh's power. It produced sons. It fed temples. It quieted resistance. It also laid the groundwork for something far stranger. Because when you've taken every woman from every conquered land, when you've absorbed their beauty, their lineage, their power, what's left? The empire would soon turn inward. And the next rulers would look not to foreign bodies, but to their own sisters. Incest wasn't just permitted, it was promoted. And Egypt would call it divine. When an empire runs out of enemies to conquer, it begins to turn inward. Egypt had taken women from Nubia, from Canaan, from the Levant. It had filled its palaces with beauty from across the known world, but that wasn't enough. Because the deeper hunger wasn't for variety, it was for purity. And the only place pure enough to touch a god was inside the royal family. The pharaoh didn't just rule by military strength, he ruled by divine blood. And to preserve that blood, untainted, unchallenged, he had to keep it circling within itself. Sister to brother, daughter to father. Not once, not occasionally, but for centuries. It wasn't a secret, it wasn't shameful. It was policy. The myth of Isis and Osiris had already given Egypt its blueprint. Osiris, the great god of death, had married his sister Isis. Together they ruled, gave birth to Horus, and passed on the throne of heaven. The story wasn't seen as strange, it was sacred. So when a pharaoh married his sister or fathered children by his daughter, he was not breaking a taboo, he was imitating the gods, and that's how the people understood it, and that's how the pharaohs justified it. Cleopatra didn't invent royal incest, she simply inherited it. More than 1,000 years before her, sibling marriage was already a well-established royal tradition. By the time she took the throne, it was no longer questioned, it was expected. She married her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. When he died in the civil war, she married her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. and after him she ruled alongside her son, who was rumored to also be her lover. That was Egypt's logic. The gods do it, so we must too. No blood spilled, no blood mixed, only the divine cycle, perfectly preserved. But there was a cost, because blood doesn't follow myths, it follows biology. By the time we reach the 18th dynasty, where the practice of incest was most extreme, the damage was visible, even in stone. Tutankhamun, the boy king, was born to a father and mother who were brother and sister. His DNA reveals the consequences clearly. A club foot, a cleft palate, a misshapen skull. Dead at 19. He married his half-sister. They had 2 daughters, both stillborn. Their mummies were buried with him, tiny and fragile, sealed in gold. The pharaoh may have been divine, but his children were breaking. Akhenaten, Tutankhamun's father, was one of the most radical kings in Egyptian history. He abolished the old gods, introduced monotheism, and named himself the living representative of the sun disk, Aten. He also married his daughters. Official inscriptions are cautious but suggestive. Paintings show Akhenaten embracing his daughters with gestures reserved only for wives. One image shows him kissing a young girl on the mouth, with one hand placed gently on her bare chest. Whether it was symbolic or literal, the message was clear. The royal womb belongs to the royal blood, and no one else may touch it. To justify it further, the state reimagined deformity as divinity. When the Ptolemaic rulers appeared on coins with bulging eyes and elongated skulls, it wasn't considered grotesque, it was a badge of sacred lineage. The abnormalities caused by generations of incest were reframed as god marks, proof that the pharaoh's body was not like yours. In some cases, female relatives were married off to pharaohs at puberty. In others, women were held in waiting, no lovers, no marriage, until the ruler was ready. The term sister wife became both title and role. It meant access, it meant power, it also meant imprisonment, and yet, even within this structure, the system worked for a time. The incestuous unions produced heirs. They kept the crown locked inside a single bloodline. They prevented noble families from gaining influence by marrying into the throne. From a political standpoint, it was airtight, but the cost was physical. By the end of the Ptolemaic period, accounts describe a royal family riddled with instability, paranoia, and physical decline. Several mummies from later dynasties show signs of severe scoliosis, brittle bones, and malformed skulls. One had to be buried sitting upright because his body was too deformed to lie flat. Divinity had begun to eat itself. Still, the tradition persisted, not out of love, but out of necessity. The people expected divine perfection, and in the twisted logic of the state, divine perfection came from isolation. If the pharaoh needed a queen, and no woman was holy enough, he'd make one from his own blood. But the body, however sacred, doesn't last forever. When the pharaoh died, the problem became even more complex. Because in Egypt, death wasn't the end, it was a continuation. And if sexuality was sacred in life, it had to be preserved in death. That belief led to something even more unsettling, more intimate, more irreversible. The question was no longer who the pharaoh would marry, but what would be done to his body and the bodies of those around him. Because in the tombs of the kings, priests performed rituals that blurred the line between resurrection and violation. In ancient Egypt, death was not an end. It was a transition, a slow, sacred passage from one world into the next. The pharaoh did not simply die, he transformed. His body was not buried and forgotten, but preserved, prepared, and reawakened through a series of rituals designed to ensure he could continue ruling, eating, breathing, and yes, even desiring beyond the grave. The Egyptians believed the soul could not function in the afterlife without its physical form, but more than that, they believed the body had to be complete. Every limb, every feature, and every function had to be restored. This wasn't limited to the eyes or the mouth. It extended all the way to the genitals, because in their vision of eternity, the dead were not still. They were active. They were expected to enjoy food, music, conversation, and sexual pleasure, just as they had in life. Central to this belief was the opening of the mouth ceremony, a ritual performed on the corpse to symbolically reactivate the senses. Priests would touch specific parts of the body, eyes, nose, ears, and lips, using carved tools and sacred words. But many versions of this ritual also included attention to the lower body, because the pharaoh was not just a speaker of truth or a consumer of offerings. He was still expected to embody divine sexuality, as that expectation was inherited from the myth of Osiris, the god of death. According to tradition, Osiris had been murdered by his jealous brother Seth, who dismembered his body into 14 pieces and scattered them across the land. His devoted wife, Isis, found 13, but the 14th, his penis, was missing. Undeterred, she fashioned a magical replacement and reassembled his body. She brought him to life long enough to conceive a son, Horus, before he returned to rule the underworld. This myth did more than comfort the grieving. It shaped the literal practices of mortuary preparation. To be whole, to be divine, to function in the afterlife, a man needed a phallus. If it was missing, priests built one. Artificial penises, sometimes made of gold, sometimes wood, sometimes resin, have been found attached to royal mummies, often bound tightly to remain in place. CT scans of Tutankhamun revealed that his mummified body had been embalmed with an erect, detachable phallus. It was not decoration, it was resurrection equipment. Female mummies, too, were treated with care in this regard. In some cases, artificial vulvas were molded and placed between the legs, carved from resin or wax. This wasn't symbolic fertility, it was functional belief. The afterlife required readiness, and yet within this highly structured system, a darker truth seeped through. In his travels through Egypt, the Greek historian Herodotus recorded a disturbing custom. He claimed that particularly beautiful women were not immediately turned over to embalmers after death. Their bodies were held in guarded chambers for 3 days. The reason, according to his source, was simple and horrifying. Some embalmers had been caught violating fresh corpses. If you've made it this far, if this journey through Egypt's forbidden rituals and sacred bodies has stirred something in you, curiosity, discomfort, even a quiet sense of awe, take a moment to like and consider subscribing. Share in the comments which part has stayed with you. I read every word. At first, scholars dismissed this as slander or misunderstanding, but then came the negative confessions found in several versions of the Book of the Dead, ritual texts buried with the dead meant to guide them through the underworld. In one of those confessions, the soul must declare, "I have not defiled the body of the dead." It's a quiet line, but a telling one. It suggests that the crime was real, that the act was feared, that laws were written not in anticipation but in response. The embalming workshop, known as the Per Nefer, was meant to be a sacred space. The embalmers were not ordinary workers, they were considered priests of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead. They shaved their bodies, abstained from sex, wore clean linen, and followed strict rituals of purity. Yet even in this sanctified environment, the body could still be desecrated. The impulse to dominate, to consume, to take, especially when sex was so intimately tied to divinity, never truly disappeared. It makes sense then that Egyptian tombs were filled not just with food, gold, and texts, but also with explicit erotic material. The Turin erotic papyrus, kept today in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, is among the most graphic artifacts from the ancient world. It depicts a series of couples, often exaggerated in form, engaged in a variety of sexual positions. These scenes were not hidden away, they were folded and buried as part of the journey into eternity. Some panels even show one partner painted in ghostly pale skin, possibly symbolizing a spirit or the recently dead. This wasn't pornography, it was preparation, a belief that pleasure in the afterlife wasn't incidental, it was expected. Tombs of elite men sometimes included jars of perfumed oils, beds carved with intimate scenes, and linen labeled for personal use. In one case, archaeologists found a set of labeled jars containing a mixture of myrrh and animal fat referred to in the inscriptions as stimulation balm. Even in death, the pharaoh was expected to be potent. But this obsession with eternal pleasure also created confusion and fear. If the dead were sexually active, and if the embalming process restored that power, how could the line between resurrection and violation be protected? The same tools used to sanctify could also be used to dominate. The same rituals meant to honor the body could easily become excuses for control. That contradiction didn't break the system, it defined it. Egypt had always walked that line where sacredness justified everything, and as long as it served the cosmic order, even the most intimate acts were sanctioned. But not all sexuality in Egypt happened in private. Some of it was paraded through the streets, and in the next chapter of this story, you'll see what happened when gods with erections were carried through cities, when women exposed themselves to statues, when lettuce became sacred, and when sex wasn't whispered in temples, but chanted in crowds. It's easy to imagine Egyptian religion as a quiet thing, carvings on walls, incense in dim corridors, chants in the flicker of lamplight. But not all of it happened in whispers. Some rituals were loud, some spilled into the streets, and some were impossible to ignore. Every year in the city of Akhmim and beyond, the people gathered to worship Min, the god of male fertility. His presence wasn't metaphorical. It was sculpted in stone, carried through crowds, and impossible to misunderstand. Min was always shown the same way, standing tall, crowned in feathers, arm raised in blessing, while his other hand grasped his erect penis. The image wasn't meant to shock, it was meant to inspire awe. This wasn't crude exaggeration, this was sacred potency. Min didn't represent sex in the abstract, he represented erection as divine force. His iconography was so consistent, so explicit, that it became its own visual language. When Egyptians carved Min into the lintel of a doorway or painted him in the corner of a wall, they weren't being provocative. They were invoking growth, virility, and life itself. And once a year they celebrated him, not in privacy, but in public. The Festival of Min was one of ancient Egypt's most sexually charged celebrations. It wasn't hidden inside temples, it unfolded in open procession. Thousands gathered, priests in white linen led the way, and at the center of it all stood a towering statue of the god. He was life-sized, sometimes larger, and always erect. His phallus was sculpted in exaggerated form, often requiring a team of bearers to support it as the statue moved through the streets. Women lined the procession route, cheering, singing, and in some cases lifting their skirts to expose themselves. This wasn't considered indecent. It was a ritual gesture, a symbolic offering. By flashing the god, women hoped to receive his blessing. Fertility wasn't guaranteed by prayer alone, it required performance. For unmarried girls, it was a chance to draw divine attention. For wives, it was a call for conception. For older women, it was a moment to laugh at time and reclaim youth, if only for a day. This interaction between sacred statue and exposed worshipper was not seen as lewd. It was choreographed, sanctioned, and documented on temple walls. And behind it all was a belief that the energy of the god, his sexual power, could be transferred simply through witnessing. The body of Min became a transmitter, and those who dared to reveal themselves became receivers of divine force. There was another part of the ritual, one that many visitors found strange, even disturbing. Lettuce. In Egyptian symbology, lettuce, particularly a tall, narrow variety, was sacred to Min. The reason had nothing to do with diet. When snapped or broken, the stalk of this lettuce released a white, milky liquid. To the ancient mind, it mimicked ejaculation. This wasn't coincidence, it was the reason lettuce was considered a sexual plant. During the festival, priests presented large stalks of lettuce to the god, reciting hymns of abundance and pleasure. They held the plants high, waved them over the statue, and sometimes distributed them to the crowd. In some versions of the rite, men would eat the lettuce as a fertility booster, while women carried the leaves home to place under their beds. The symbolism was clear. This wasn't a vegetable, it was a metaphor for male climax, and its consumption was part of the ritual circuit. By eating, they internalized the power. By offering, they honored its source. At the climax of the festival, 4 bulls were released from the temple grounds into the open fields. Each bull represented Min's virility, unleashed upon the earth. As they charged into the countryside, followed by priests and celebrants, their mating with cows symbolized the fertilization of the land itself. It was all connected: bulls, God, lettuce, phallus, flood, seed. Egypt's worldview didn't separate agriculture from sex. It didn't separate the body from the cosmos. Everything was tied to cycles, of water, of wombs, of rituals repeated until belief became law. Even the pharaoh played a role. At the height of the festival, he would cut a symbolic sheaf of grain, representing his own sexual potency and its contribution to the fertility of Egypt. In that moment, the god and king became mirrors, both erect, both powerful, both required. Foreign observers were often stunned by the openness of it all. Greek historian Herodotus wrote about the fertility processions with a mixture of awe and confusion. He noted the songs, the laughter, and the explicit statues being paraded in front of cheering crowds. To a Greek, whose gods were equally promiscuous but often veiled in metaphor, the bluntness of Egyptian worship felt extreme. But to the Egyptians this was order, this was how the world continued. It wasn't about lust, it was about balance. To suppress sex was to suppress harvest, to silence the phallus was to silence the flood. And so they danced, they sang, they honored the god who never softened, who never aged, who never went away. Somewhere, hidden in the records, are quiet notes that suggest not everyone was comfortable with the ritual. One faded papyrus hints at tension between temple priests. Some wanted to elevate Min's symbolism and reduce his bodily form. Others insisted that the physical representation was essential, that without the image, the energy would be lost. In the end, the image won. The statue kept his erection. The festival kept its flesh, and the people kept dancing. But there was another side to Egyptian sexuality, a quieter one not celebrated in song, but whispered in chambers, mixed into brews and folded into spells. Because sometimes fertility wasn't invited, it was resisted. And in the world of Egyptian women, sexuality wasn't always about pleasure or blessing. Sometimes it was about survival, about preventing birth, about controlling when and how to bleed, conceive, or miscarry. Their secrets were not carried through the streets. They were buried in scrolls and smeared on lint. They were handed from mother to daughter, scribe to apprentice, priestess to patient. And those secrets reveal a different kind of power. Not all sex in ancient Egypt was about pleasure or power. Some of it was about prevention. For all its public celebrations of fertility, its statues of Min, its offerings of lettuce, its festivals that danced with desire, Egypt was also a land of control. It needed to be. The Nile gave life, but it also demanded order. Too much flood, and the fields drowned. Too little, and they cracked. The same went for the body, especially the female body. And so Egyptian women learned to manage reproduction not just through ritual, but through medicine. What they knew wasn't guesswork. It was science, blended with symbolism passed through generations, and recorded in some of the oldest gynecological texts the world has ever seen. The Kahun Papyrus, dated to around 1850 BCE, reads like an ancient women's health manual. It outlines treatments for missed periods, painful intercourse, and most notably, contraception. One recipe calls for inserting crocodile dung into the vagina, mixed with honey and sodium carbonate. To modern ears, it sounds absurd, but the dung was highly alkaline, which likely created a hostile environment for sperm. Crude, yes, but possibly effective. And that's what mattered. Effectiveness, not comfort, not dignity, not even safety. The Ebers Papyrus, another medical document from the same period, takes it further. It suggests a mixture of acacia gum, dates, and honey, soaked into lint and inserted vaginally. Today, we know acacia contains lactic acid, a compound found in modern spermicides. These ancient women may not have known the chemistry, but they understood the outcome. Contraception wasn't limited to physical barriers. Some women drank mixtures of pomegranate and beer for several days to disrupt fertility. Modern analysis shows pomegranate seeds contain natural estrogens, compounds that can interfere with ovulation. These remedies weren't spells, they were early hormone manipulation, dressed in the language of plants and prayer. When conception did occur but was unwanted, women turned to a different kind of knowledge, recipes to release blocked menstruation, a coded phrase for early-stage abortion. One mixture involved celery and beer, another combined dates, onions, and crushed plant roots. The instructions were often vague, but the intent was clear, to undo what had begun. Alongside the physical treatments came magic. Egyptian medicine didn't draw sharp lines between science and sorcery. A woman seeking protection against pregnancy might wear an amulet shaped like the god Bes, a dwarf-like deity who warded off evil spirits and protected childbirth. These amulets weren't decorative, they were worn constantly, sometimes tied around the abdomen, sometimes hung between the legs. They were charged with intention, with incantations spoken in dark corners and remembered only by women. One magical spell from the London Leiden Papyrus instructs the user to bind the womb against conception using a series of spoken phrases. The language is poetic, commanding the body like a temple gate, close as stone, seal as bronze, let no man enter. These weren't state-sanctioned rituals. They weren't carved into temples or celebrated in festivals. They were quiet acts of bodily autonomy, carried out in kitchens and courtyards, behind the curtains of a society that praised fertility but punished those who controlled it. And yet the contradiction was everywhere. Pharaohs married their sisters to preserve bloodlines, demanded concubines to produce heirs, and participated in public fertility rites. But Egyptian women were often tasked with preventing the very life their culture revered. The burden of balance fell on them. Too many pregnancies meant danger, death in childbirth, starvation for unwanted children, or shame for unwed girls. Too few, and a woman could be cast out as barren, her worth reduced to dust. Inscriptions don't tell us how these women felt. They speak through formulas, not emotion. But the presence of contraceptive methods, recorded meticulously, passed down for generations, speaks loudly. These weren't fringe remedies, they were part of life. The most haunting part is how normal it all became. The insertion of dung, the drinking of pomegranate beer, the prayers spoken at dawn over oil and cloth. They weren't considered desperate acts. They were tradition, no different than washing or braiding hair. And still, despite all this knowledge, the body remained vulnerable. Consent was not always given. Control was not always possible. Sexuality, even when practiced in secret, was always watched, from the eyes of gods, from the hands of priests, from the laws written by men. That tension between reverence and control defined the Egyptian approach to sex. It celebrated the body, but only within lines drawn by power. It elevated desire, but only when it served divine or dynastic purpose. It preserved the body after death, but even then, it could not always protect it. Because there is one more chapter in this story. One final act, hidden beneath the incense and the hymns. A truth so unsettling that even the Egyptians had to write it down, not to record it, but to swear it had not been done. In the sacred texts buried with the dead, there is a quiet confession. A line among many, spoken to the gods of judgment. I have not defiled the body of the dead. That line wasn't metaphorical. It was literal, and the reason it had to be said is the darkest secret Egypt ever tried to contain. Egypt built entire cities for the dead. It filled them with gold and linen, sacred texts, perfumes, and promises. But for all its splendor, for all its carvings of resurrection and eternal bliss, there was one fear Egypt never fully buried. That fear was silence. Not the silence of grief, the silence of the tomb violated. Herodotus, the Greek historian who walked through Egypt's temples in the 5th century BCE, left behind more than just travel notes. He wrote of a practice so disturbing it echoed across cultures for centuries. According to him, embalmers, priests tasked with preserving the bodies of the dead, were sometimes kept from touching the corpses of beautiful women. Not because of reverence, but because of temptation. The story goes like this. When a particularly attractive woman died, her family would not deliver the body immediately to the embalmers. They would wait 3 full days. By then, decomposition had begun. The skin would dull, the lips would slacken, and the scent would be stronger. The body would be less inviting, less desirable. It was, in effect, a security measure. Not against thieves, against those entrusted with sacred duty. Scholars long dismissed Herodotus's claim as foreign slander, a Greek exaggeration about Egyptian rituals. But then the Confessions appeared. In the Book of the Dead, scrawled into scrolls and painted on coffin lids, was a passage repeated over and over. A list of negative declarations, sins the deceased swore they did not commit. One of those sins stood out. I have not had intercourse with a corpse. The phrasing is blunt. It appears without poetry. Sandwiched between more expected denials, I have not stolen. I have not murdered. I have not cursed the gods. This line arrives with jarring precision. The Egyptians didn't just imagine the possibility. They feared it enough to inscribe it, which means it happened. The embalming workshop, or per nifa, was a ritual chamber where the body was purified, anointed, and wrapped. The process was intimate. Priests removed internal organs, treated the flesh, and touched nearly every part of the deceased with oils and instruments. These men were trained to see the body as sacred, not sensual. But even in this environment, shaped by rules, hymns, and layers of linen, desire found a way in. No names remain. No records of trials. No law codes detailing punishment. Egypt did not write publicly about this crime, but the fact that it was hidden and that protections were enacted against it tells us enough. Somewhere behind the incense smoke and the temple chants, this transgression existed, quiet, denied, but real. It's easy to villainize a few men, to say the embalmers failed, but that's not the whole story, because Egypt made sex divine. It made the body holy, it made physical pleasure a pathway to the gods, and it made resurrection contingent on the body's completeness, including its sexual organs, its vitality, and its readiness to reawaken. Is it any wonder then that boundaries blurred? When the dead were dressed for eternity, given prosthetic genitals, placed in sexual positions on scrolls, surrounded by oils and incense meant to stir the senses, how clearly was the line drawn between sanctity and objectification? Even the dead were expected to be fertile, and where fertility is expected, violation is only a step away. The sin wasn't just what was done to the body, it was that no one spoke of it afterward. The victims could not protest. The priests would not confess. And the gods remained silent. Egypt buried these stories under layers of gold and ritual. It painted divine scenes on the ceilings and told tales of the afterlife filled with rivers and lotus blossoms. But hidden in a line of script, buried deep inside a scroll, was the sentence that gave it all away. I have not defiled the body of the dead. No metaphor, no allegory. Just a truth so terrible they had to promise it wasn't theirs. And that's what makes the story of Egypt so haunting. Not just the public festivals, not the incestuous bloodlines, not even the ritual masturbation of kings. It's that for thousands of years, sexuality was treated as sacred until it wasn't, until it was weaponized, until it was bureaucratized, until it was ritualized into submission. Egypt didn't hide sex. It carved it in stone. It didn't repress desire. It sanctified it, then turned it into law. And once something is law, it can justify anything, even the unthinkable. We began with a god who touched himself in the dark, birthing creation from pleasure. We walked through festivals that honored erections, through queens forced to marry brothers, through contraceptives made from dung and spells chanted in linen. We opened tombs. We touched mummies. We followed the rituals from the bedroom to the riverbank to the grave. And now we've seen what lies beneath the beauty, a system that used sexuality to build a kingdom, and silence to keep it standing. So the next time someone tells you Egypt was the cradle of civilization, you might agree, but now you know what they rocked that cradle with.